The Commedia dell Arte was a theater movement that occurred in Europe during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It involved professional comedians who toured with similar characters or stock characters and improvised comedies that were broad, physical, and often violent. Many of the elements of the Commedia dell Arte influenced such famous playwrights as William Shakespeare and the 17th century French playwright Molière. We have discussed two of the three groups of stock characters of the Commedia dell Arte, the old men and the comic servants, or zanne. Now we will look at the third group of stock characters of the Commedia dell Arte, the young lovers. Unlike the old men and the zanne, the young lovers did not perform in theatrical masks. They were the most natural characters of the Commedia dell Arte. The young lovers were the characters that the audience rooted for. Often, the young man and woman in a Commedia dell Arte scenario were in love with one another, but one of the old men, typically Pantalone, was either in love with the young woman or the young woman was the old man's daughter, and he wanted to marry her off to another rich old man. In the typical Commedia dell Arte scenario, the female servant Colombina would work behind the scenes to help the young lovers overcome the obstacles and become joined in marriage by the end of the play. The young lovers were easily recognizable by virtue of the fact that they did not wear masks. They also wore the fashionable garments of the day, which naturally evolved over the 3 centuries of Commedia's existence. The young lovers, both men and women, were young, attractive, witty, and sentimental. They had such romantic names as Isabella and Flavio. The actors who played the young lovers were accomplished at singing, dancing, and reciting poetry. As the Commedia dell Arte developed, the young lovers slowly began to become naive and foolish. In fact, one of the old men, El Capitano, in the later development of the Commedia dell Arte would play the role of the young male lover. As we have mentioned before, another of the important elements of the Commedia dell Arte was the perfection and performance of specialized comic bits of business referred to as lazze, or lazzo. Even though the plays themselves were not scripted, the lazze of the Commedia dell Arte was worked out and perfected by the player or players that performed them. There was the lazze of the ladder. This was a comic routine that was performed by 2 or more players. One player would climb a ladder while the other player would hold it. As the player who was climbing the ladder would get to the top, the other's concentration would wander and the ladder would begin to tip, and the players would engage in an acrobatic, near-disastrous comedy. Another is the lazze of the toothache. An old man would complain of a toothache, and his servant would go through a number of absurd attempts to pull the sore tooth out that would ultimately result in the old man suffering more from the tooth pulling than from the toothache itself. Commedia lazze was usually broad, often breathtaking in its precision and accomplishment. In summarizing the important elements of the Commedia dell Arte, we note that Commedia dell Arte literally meant professional players or professional comedians. It is the first time in history that actors make a living at the art of acting. It is also the first time that women appear on stage. The Commedia dell Arte performed improvised comedies from a rough outline or scenario. They performed comic bits of business perfected by a player or a small group of players referred to as lazze, or sometimes lazzo. Most of the actors in Commedia troupes spent their entire career playing one character. There were 3 different groups of stock characters in the Commedia dell Arte: the old men, the comic servants or zanne, and the young lovers. The Commedia dell Arte evolved from the theater and circus of ancient Rome, particularly from the ancient Roman playwright Plautus. They also influenced some of the greatest playwrights to follow them, most notably William Shakespeare and Molière. Their traditions still influence comedy today. Well, that concludes our discussion of the Commedia dell Arte. Time to finish your task for this section.